Welcome to the 7 core management behaviors, when and how to use them. This is Module 5, Praise and Correct. This series is brought to you by John Dario and the Retail Management Formula, LLC. In Module 4, we discussed the fact that follow-up, the third of our 7 management behaviors, acts as a bridge between the left side of the management situation grid and the right side of the grid. In other words, follow-up connects the management behaviors that occur before employee performance and those that occur during or after employee performance. More specifically, follow-up is the bridge that connects the management behavior of delegate with the management behaviors of praise and correct. Said another way, after delegating a task to an employee, follow-up is the behavior that enables a manager to either praise or correct the employee's performance of that task. The objective of praise is to reinforce an employee's behavior so that it continues in the future. Obviously, praise is meant to be used with good behavior. The manager does, in fact, wish to continue. The objective of correct is to fix an employee's behavior so that it will better meet expectations in the future. This implies that correct is meant to be used when an employee's behavior falls short of expectations. Let's check to ensure this logic works in the context of our management situation grid. Praise and correct fall into the part of the grid that represents situations where the employee capability is high and the timing of management action is during or after employee performance. Let's look at the first part first. Does the mission of both praise and correct fit with the situation of an employee's capability being high? Certainly we can all agree that praise will happen when capability is high. But what about correct? Why would a manager need to correct behavior from an employee whose capability is high? Well, there's all kinds of reasons, ranging from lack of effort to careless mistakes to willful disobedience. An even trickier question is why a manager would not want to correct the behavior of an employee whose capability is low. That situation will actually be covered in our next module under the Management Behavior Coach. Remember that a manager who's using the management situation grid properly will only delegate to an employee who is fully trained, and by definition, that means the employee's capability is considered high. So both praise and correct are used only when an employee's capability is high. The second part of the situation is easy. Does a manager use praise and correct during or after an employee's action? Of course, otherwise there will be nothing to praise or correct. You may have already come to the conclusion that praise and correct are very close sister behaviors. Both behaviors fall under the more general term feedback. The feedback sisters share a lot of common traits, and we'll review those details. They also have some important distinctions, and we'll discuss those as well. Let's start with some tips for how to deliver the most effective praise feedback. Tip number 1 is be specific. Consider the example of a manager giving the following praise. Great job helping that customer. How effective will that praise be in reinforcing the behavior to ensure it's repeated in the future? Compare it to this praise. When you dropped the task you were working on and offered your full attention to that customer, you really made her feel important. Nice job making yourself so focused on helping the customer. Which of these two examples of praise is more likely to result in a recurrence of the behavior in the future? Hopefully you answered that the second example is the more effective of the two. For one reason, the specific details given by the manager demonstrate that the manager was truly watching, and that makes the feedback more authentic. For another reason, the specific details point out to the employee exactly what she or he needs to replicate in the future. Without the details, the employee is left to figure out on her or his own which aspect of the behavior was worthy of the special praise. That makes it less likely that they will know which aspect to replicate. So the more specific a manager is in their praise, the more effective that praise will be. Tip number 2 is to focus on the behavior, not just the result. Have you ever played miniature golf? Most mini golf courses have crazy hole configurations with bumps and hills and twists, and it's almost impossible to figure out the best path to the hole. Sometimes you get that back and forth roll that bounces off the back wall and goes in for a hole-in-one, and you get excited for the great result. But you know the result was as much due to random luck as it was to your great planning and skill. Sometimes a similar thing can happen at work. A positive result can be due to external factors rather than to good behavior. And the opposite is true as well. A bad result can also occur because of external factors, even when the behaviors were all positive. I'm a big believer in the idea that consistent implementation of good behaviors will, over time, deliver the best results. but that doesn't mean it will always happen that way. As managers, we should focus on reinforcing the positive behaviors. We should connect the positive behaviors to positive results when appropriate, but we should never reinforce just the results without discussion of the positive behaviors that produce the results. Tip number 3 is to connect the praise to past conversations. Consider the following example of praise. Yesterday, we talked about the need for you to use open-ended questions in order to learn more about customer needs. With that last customer, you started the interaction by asking her to tell you how she would be using the product. That resulted in her giving you more information than if you had just asked if she needed help. Nice job with the open-ended question. By connecting the feedback to a coaching conversation from the previous day, the manager was able to specify purposeful and intentional progress on the part of the employee. This has a number of side benefits. First, it sends the clear message that the manager is serious about following up on past conversations. Second, it gives the employee extra credit for truly listening and responding to the past feedback. And third, it establishes the praise as part of a larger developmental initiative rather than a one-off bit of random feedback. All of this increases the impact of the feedback and therefore enhances the power of reinforcement of the positive behavior. Tip number 4 is to connect praise feedback to patterns of positive behavior whenever possible. Consider the following example. I watched you use a very effective open-ended question with that last customer. That's 3 days in a row that I've seen you effectively use open-ended questions to learn more about customer needs. Well done with the consistency of good sales technique this week. Patterns of positive behavior are better than one-time displays of positive behavior, since the repetition shows true understanding of the expectation and the ability to consistently meet the expectation. Employees want to know that their boss recognizes their consistent effort over time, so praising a pattern carries more weight in reinforcing the behavior than praising just a single instance. Tip number 5 is to vary the way in which you deliver the feedback in order to keep the praise fresh and new, even if the underlying message is repetitive. People are all different and they respond differently to various forms of praise. Some love public recognition while others prefer private one-on-one feedback. Some like the feedback in writing so they can go back to it later, while others prefer hearing praise via direct verbal conversation. When it comes to actual rewards, some may like a personal reward, like the chance to leave early one day, while others prefer a tangible token of appreciation, such as a certificate or a trophy. The truth is that most employees appreciate any of these methods of praise, and they appreciate them even more when they receive them in a variety of ways. Now let's move on to talk about tips for providing the most effective correct feedback. The first 4 tips for corrective feedback are exactly the same as those for praise feedback. Number 1, be specific. Number 2, focus on behavior, not only the results. Number 3, connect to past conversations. And number 4, recognize patterns of behavior. All of the same reasons for these tips apply to correct feedback as they do for praise feedback. Therefore, I won't waste your time by repeating the logic that we just went over. The 5th tip, however, is different. Tip number 5 is to be appropriately progressive in the tone of your feedback. The tone of corrective feedback can range anywhere from a simple reminder statement to employment termination, and there are many steps in between. Progressive corrective feedback means that a manager uses increasingly more serious tone as the level of seriousness of the negative behavior increases. In other words, corrective feedback builds progressively upon prior use of corrective feedback. I'll now give a quick description of the 6 levels of corrective feedback. The first level is simple corrective feedback. There's nothing more than a reminder or a notification to an employee that their behavior has fallen short of expectation. There's no punitive intent with this level of feedback, and therefore, the tone should be matter-of-fact rather than disciplinary and judgmental. In fact, in many situations, the tone can be supportive and understanding. This level of correction is appropriate when the employee's negative behavior is an isolated incident, and it is not a violation of an extremely important expectation. Here's the logic. Just because an employee has been trained on a task, it doesn't mean that employee will always perform the task perfectly. There are lots of understandable reasons why an employee might occasionally fall short of an expectation. Perhaps there are multiple expectations that must be met at the same time, and the employee is challenged by the need to juggle so many priorities at one time. Perhaps the task is particularly difficult and by its nature is hard to perform perfectly every time. Perhaps the employee just had a momentary lapse in effort after an especially long stint of excellent performance. These are all situations where a manager can show understanding for the employee's failure to meet an expectation. It doesn't mean the manager should ignore the negative behavior, but it doesn't have to be a major disciplinary conversation. Simple corrective feedback might sound something like, I noticed that you arrived to work about 20 minutes late today. I know you realize the extra burden that puts on the rest of the team, and you have not been late to work at all over the past few months. I'm sure this was a one-time issue, so no big deal. Please give me a call if you are ever running late in the future. The next level of corrective feedback is counseling. At this level, the manager shows more concern about the employee's failure to meet an expectation. Counseling generally comes after multiple instances of simple corrective feedback. The two goals of counseling are to let the employee know that there's concern about an ongoing problem and to try to uncover the root cause of the problem. An example of counseling might sound something like this. I have spoken to you 3 different times in the last 2 weeks about arriving late to work. While I considered 1 or 2 late arrivals as isolated incidents, I now see a pattern that is a problem. What's causing you to be late so often, and what solution can you put in place to fix the problem? When counseling does not work and the problem continues, corrective feedback moves on to the level of verbal warning. As the label suggests, this is now the level where the employee is officially warned of the consequences of their negative behavior if it continues. A verbal warning might sound something like, we spoke last week about your repeated late arrivals to work. I told you that it could not continue, and you committed to me that it would not be a problem going forward. Yet once again today you were 15 minutes late to work. This has become a serious problem, and I am issuing you a verbal warning that if you continue the pattern of arriving late, you will lose your position with our company. I don't want you to lose your job, so please tell me what I can do to help you meet the expectation of getting to work on time for every one of your shifts. If the problem still persists, corrective feedback should progress to the next level, written warning. A written warning is an official documentation of the fact that the employee has been told their job is in jeopardy due to their bad behavior. Each company has its own format and process for issuing written warnings, so I won't be any more specific in this module. If the problem persists despite issuance of a written warning, typical practice is to issue one more final written warning. This process of multiple warnings is meant to ensure the employee has had ample warning and ample opportunity to correct the negative behavior before the employment is actually terminated. And if none of the levels of corrective feedback work to actually correct the problem, the last level is termination. It's unfortunate, but sometimes termination is the only way that the negative behavior will be stopped. Note that there are certain behaviors for which progressive levels of corrective feedback may be skipped. For example, some negative behaviors, such as stealing or attacking a customer, are so egregious that manager action will skip straight to termination. Other negative behaviors, though not immediate grounds for termination, must skip over counseling and verbal warning and instead be documented as a written warning on their first instance. These are situations which will undoubtedly be directed by senior management or by the Human Resources Department. Aside from these exceptions, progressive tone is an important aspect to making corrective feedback most effective. Tip number 6 is really important. Tip number 6 is to always use a teaching tone rather than a scolding tone. Remember that the whole point of corrective feedback is to correct a negative behavior, not punish an employee. Little good will ever come from scolding an employee, as scolding will only create negative emotions such as embarrassment, anger, and resentment. Use of a scolding tone is generally due to a manager's inability to control their own anger toward an employee's negative behavior. The key to avoiding this is to remember that the situation is not about you, the manager, and how it made you feel. The situation is about the employee's behavior, and that is outside of you, the manager. A teaching tone can be firm and direct without being angry and scolding. One final thought to finish up this module. Feedback in both of its sister forms of praise and correct is the management behavior that keeps trained and capable employees on track with positive performance. Praise reinforces the good behaviors and helps to ensure they will be repeated in the future. Corrective feedback seeks to change negative behavior and return the employee's performance to the positive behavior they have shown themselves capable of in the past. Through effective feedback, managers can help employees perform at their best. That brings us to the end of Module 5. Our next module is Module 6, where we will discuss coaching. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time.